Welcome back to Science vs. Conspiracy Over Coffee, the show that explores the possibilities of what can't easily be categorized or explained away. I'm your host, Conspiracy, otherwise known as Bob. Today, a dog who made the remarkable journey home after being lost 4,000 kilometers away, and the paranormal connections pets seem to have with their owners. Over the next hour, brew some coffee, pull up a chair, and open your mind. Today on Science vs. Conspiracy Over Coffee, we have a chat with our guest, an accomplished author and researcher. He holds a PhD in English literature and was an academic fellow at the University of Durham. He has also lectured at the University of Durham and Cardiff University. Welcome, Richard, to the show.
Thanks, many thanks. Thank you.
So you have a quite impressive resume. So can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became interested in researching these animals and their apparent psychic ability, paranormal abilities?
Yeah, thanks. I was researching other subjects really on old newspapers, which a tremendous resource now. It's a bit like having a library the size of a city on your computer, these wonderful old newspapers, America, Britain. And I would just keep getting distracted as I was researching vampires and the soul and cannibalism for other books by animal stories. I just think that's too good to waste, so I'd have to copy down the animal story. And I started thinking, look, I've got a book here. So I assembled these 19th century animal stories, elephants, parrots, wild animals that escaped constantly across London and the UK, and just simpler pet stories about dogs and cats. And immediately I was finding, for example, a story about a cat that was moved with its family from Lincoln in Britain to London, which is about 100 miles.
Okay.
And in a bitter winter, atrocious snowstorms, the cat simply walked back to Lincoln because it didn't like its new house,
Wow.
So, yeah, this is a bit less common with cats, but they do it, and they tend to do it a bit more with the house. They're not fussed about the owners. There's rather cavalier fashion.
That's a cat, though.
Yeah, it's a bit of a cat thing from what I know. So I was also getting dog stories. I got a lovely one. I used to work in the University of Durham, which is a beautiful part of England. Actually, the inspiration probably for C.S. Lewis's Narnia, because Lewis was mad on Durham. And there was a story about the 19th century when a dog was taken on the train, kind of sent as a sort of item separately from its owner from Durham to York, which is now it's about a 50-minute train journey.
Okay.
And the dog was muzzled just to be sure that it wouldn't nip anybody. And the dog made a break for it in York. Everyone's a bit panicked. Where's it gone? A few days later, it turns up back in Durham with the muzzle still on, so it couldn't eat. It couldn't really drink, I don't think. So I assembled all these stories into a singing mouse at Buckingham Palace, which is another story altogether. But there really was actually a singing mouse in London that became famous and was asked to go. A singing mouse, yeah. I mean, they caught this thing. They thought it was a bird trapped in their flat in London. Caught this thing, found it was a mouse, caught it alive, and soon enough they're making money out of this, performing at these rooms in Regent Street with the public paying handsomely to come and hear the mouse. I couldn't believe this one, but you keep hearing it over and over again. Guy from the Times comes to hear the mouse and says it sings a bit like a nightingale. There's actually an American naturalist, Lockwood. A guy called Lockwood was a minister in the late 19th century, and he had a singing mouse. A couple, I think, a female one, and it would sing for 9 minutes whilst it was constantly racing around its cage, bravura sort of delight.
Right.
A musical friend of mine listened to it and says it's a bit like a sort of crazy jazz. So, yeah, Victoria did summon the singing mouse of London to sing for her children. And this was one of many cases of prize mice. Then I got into the paranormal separately in another book called The Real Vampires. And there was a lot of crazy folklore and crazy, pretty ugly behavior, unfortunately. Right down to 2004, you could find some crazy scenes going on in Romania just after Stephanie Meyer had signed her contract for Twilight. It was still going strong.
Oh, wow.
And while I was researching this, I was kind of staggered, but I could work things out rationally most of the time. The thing I couldn't work out was people saying over and over again, hundreds of years, different countries, different continents, that the vampire behaves like a poltergeist. It bangs on the roof, it throws things around the kitchen, it throws people out of bed, it beats them up. I mean, it terrorized the entire town of Mykonos in 1700, such that everyone was camping out in the winter in the countryside and so on. So I thought, what the hell is this? I've not really ever come across a poltergeist. And I started reading up. I got a big pile of books in the British Library, come out for lunch, and my head's all reeling from this madness, as it seemed to me. It was 2012, I think.
Okay.
And I go out for lunch with a friend who I've known for 8 years. And I say, have you ever come across poltergeist? It's on my mind. And she goes white. She goes very quiet and sort of uptight and says, can we go somewhere private? She tells me she's had a poltergeist following her around for 18 months.
Okay.
I get back to Cardiff. A guy I've known for 12 years tells me a similar thing. It's not live anymore, but it's back in his childhood or his teens. And so I start to think, look, if people you know and have been through some heavy weather with you only tell this when you ask them, something a bit odd is going on here. And ever since, it's just snowballed by the year, by the day. I can just wander about in the park and ask people, do you believe in ghosts? And I get new stories all the time. So it's been a strange voyage of discovery, which I never expected to make when I was 40 odd years old. But yeah, it's been a great roller coaster.
Yeah, that's exciting. Yeah, people are, I guess once you kind of gain their confidence, they're more open to talking about some of the strange things that they've seen. They may not know, they might not have a name for it, so may not know it's a poltergeist or what they've seen, but they do open up a little bit. And it's amazing how similar a lot of these stories are, the commonality between them.
That's it. I mean, you just think, rational, functional people all across history, all across the world, they're all saying the same thing. You've got to sit up and listen, really, and try and get to the bottom of it. Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back and tell us more about Bobbie the Wonder Dog.
Yeah, thank you. This is the archetype, and it is his centenary this August. So his family, Frank and Elizabeth Brazier, ran a restaurant in Oregon, right over on the West Coast, Silverton, and they had a couple of daughters, I think in their teens, Leona and Nova, and they drive with Bobbie on, I think a road trip. They wanted just to kind of drive, and they would stay overnight at what were called tourist camps. So sort of little bungalow you could take for the night, very casual and simple. And Bobbie, you can see on photographs I'll send you, rode on the running board of the car outside, or sat on the suitcase that was strapped to the back, and was quite happy to jump on and off if he got distracted, but come back when it pleased him. Car going fairly slowly, I guess. So they drive across by stages to Indiana, to a place called Walcott, where they have relatives to catch up with. And I think it's just Frank Brazier on his own at one point, filling up the car at a petrol station. And Bobbie is chased suddenly by 3 stray dogs at once. And he bolts. And Brazier's not worried because Bobbie's always roaming away from the car coming back. But no, he doesn't come back. He sounds the horn a few times, doesn't come back. So they start searching properly. The next day, everyone's getting very upset. They search further. They get lots of people helping, just cannot find him. And they drive on for the last stage of their trip into northeastern Indiana. So importantly, they go a bit further away from Oregon. This is interesting, as we'll see. And yeah, obviously the family's distraught. The girl's particularly heartbroken. He organizes notes at all the tourist camps on the way back where they stop going east again. And he leaves messages that if anyone finds Bobbie, he'll pay for him to be crated up and sent on a train back to Oregon. But August, September, October, November, December all pass. Unhappy Christmas back in Silverton, and January goes through, and then on the 15th of February, I should say that it was on the 15th of August that Bobbie was lost.
Okay.
15th of February in Silverton, one of the girls, I think it was Nova, is wandering outside the restaurant with a friend, And suddenly, and I would love, as a historian, there's a lot of moments you'd like to actually be at, looking and listening, but this probably tops them all. I would love to have been there when she suddenly says, "Isn't that Bobbie?" And at the sound of his name, the dog turns around, worn to the bone, paws erect, nails worn down, emaciated, exhausted, but leaps at this girl and flings himself at her face, yelping with relief and kind of half-strangled sobs, it's been described. And yeah, that was the start of the celebrity of Bobbie the Wonder Dog. Had a steak and some cream, I think. First off.
Well-deserved.
Yeah, very well deserved. And next thing you know, is being hounded by the paparazzi.
The paparazzi?
With letters pouring in to, it's a great topic for puns, this one.
Yeah.
Pouring into Silverton, addressed to Bobbie the Wonder Dog. Newspapers are all raging with it. He plays himself in his own silent film, The Call of the West,
right,
in 2024. And there's still one reel available to see. I think it's in the public domain. And yeah, he gets all sorts of honors, presents, all the rest of it. But most importantly, I think they're able, with all the messages coming from people across the route, to reconstruct his journey. So they work out that he stayed several weeks when he was quite badly injured with one family in Des Moines in Iowa. And they also work out that initially, sometime after being chased away on the 15th of August, he follows the route of the car.
Oh, wow.
Which is interesting, as I'll explain, because he doesn't go back west. He goes further northeast into Indiana. And this is significant, I think, as I'll try and argue with various cases and his own. The other thing is that he's also, when he does go back west, he stops at every single tourist camp, as they're called, those little bungalows, petrol stations, that the braziers themselves stop at.
Wow, that's amazing.
I'll explain why I think this is significant. But obviously the big question to round this off initially is, how on earth could he know where he was going? You know, this is the thing that's been dangling for decades. And I think I've got a handle on it. It's not fully explained by any means, but there's a lot of interesting comparisons with other, journeys.
Right. So is it more like how pigeons have that internal compass, or how salmon swim upstream to return to where they were, like for the spawning grounds, or is it something else? Like, do they have some abilities?
I mean, there's a great kind of pioneering researcher sort of on the edges of modern science who sort of pushes big questions like this. And he believes that kind of thing. He believes that we don't understand how swifts and swallows come back to the exact same barn, hundreds or maybe it's thousands of miles each year. And horses can do this, cats can do it, ducks can do it. Many, many dogs have done it. Funnily enough, a dog was doing it in 1923 before Bobbie got lost. He was sold. Let me see where he was initially. Yeah, he was sold from his home in Denver by his owner. I don't really know why, but people weren't so sentimental about dogs, perhaps, to Missouri. And presently, he turned up back in Denver, and he covered, you'll know this better than me, but he covered 700 miles.
Wow.
So not a bad rival to Bobbie. Don't know anything about the breed or the name of the dog. You can only hope the owner kept him and didn't, send him
off
to
again.
Missouri in a temper, saying bad dog. But that was just one case, and of course a lot of them didn't get publicized, I think. So yeah, Sheldrake, Rupert Sheldrake, who's written a brilliant book called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, has all sorts of fascinating stories about animal paranormal abilities, telepathy, and he thinks that all these animals probably are using what he calls a morphic field. And the evidence I've seen from different cases, cats, dogs, horses, is that there's almost a kind of psychic signature on the home they want to get to, but also on the person. And I'll give you in a moment a classic case from the British First World War, which is very strange, but well attested. And they can navigate to the person or the house because they're not always in the same place. So, yeah, the Sheldrake cites experiments, and a guy called Robert Charman has written a great essay on this in a book on the paranormal. And in the 30s, a German guy was releasing dogs a few miles from home, watching what they did. In the 60s, another German guy was doing it.
Mhm.
Sheldrake did it in the 90s with a guy who had a very adventurous dog in Britain. And what's fascinating is that the dogs, not all of them can do it, about a third can do it. So you get somebody who's got two huskies. One husky can do it, the other husky can't. The dogs are classified as alpha dogs or upper intermediary dogs.
Okay.
They're certainly not. The breeds that tend to do it, collies, terriers. I have got a Pomeranian, believe it or not.
I got one too.
I could. Oh, you need to hear this in a moment then.
Yeah.
Don't let him out on adventures. But they're not bloodhounds. They're not the sniffing dogs that you'd expect with the great sense of smell.
Mhm.
Collie's got an okay sense of smell, but it's not that phenomenal. And they don't seem to sniff. They watch them very carefully. They're not sniffing. The ones that can do it, they scout about for a little while. They point in various directions, and presently they keep pointing in the direction of home, and their head goes up almost as though it's been snapped to a kind of magnetic point. It's very sudden. It's unnatural. It's a very sort of stiff posture.
Mhm.
And then they will go home. If they're distracted, they will follow another dog. But if they're not, they will just go home. And they will tend to work best in misty conditions or nighttime conditions. So anything they see is not distracting them. They're not apparently depending on the sense of vision. And I found just recently a lovely story from Bedford in England, which is near where I grew up.
Mhm.
1933, a guy writes a short letter to the newspaper, and he just says, "Sir, my friend has a dog which was moved from one house to another about 3.5 miles. He says several times each week it walks back to its old house. It is told, here's some food, go back home. It eats the food, it goes back home." Now, this doesn't seem a big deal, 3.5 miles, but the dog is completely blind.
Oh, wow.
And it does this over
That's
and over again.
remarkable.
It's almost like a set of experiments because the dog just does it every week, more than once. So you've got case after case. 1933, not too much traffic in England, luckily. But yeah, the dog is clearly not using its sense of sight. It might be using its sense of smell, but if so, what is it following? A dog needs to follow a scent trail.
Mhm.
The old owner is not going to the house. There's nobody he knows going to the house. So this fits with the conclusions of various researchers that the dog is kind of drawn on a sort of psi trail or paranormal trail by this signal sort of pulsing on its owners or on the house, whether one or the other.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I've been finding out and doing a little bit of background work on this is that the animals, especially dogs, we always say that we pick the dog, but in fact, in a lot of cases, the dogs pick the owner and they attach themselves beyond just the owner-dog relationship. That there's something more that the dog has to guide us through various things throughout our lives with the pet, and that's I guess psychic connection between the owner and the dog is strong, and what drives them, that connection that they're able to travel 260 kilometers or miles from one place to another, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I hadn't considered that side of it, but it's funny you say it because there's a story in A Singing Mouse where in the 19th century, a guy is with his dog and he's about to get on a ferry or a little boat going on a bigger river.
Mm-hmm.
And the dog yanks him by the ankle, by his trousers, I think, won't let him get on this boat. And this could be a coincidence, or it could be kind of a sort of rare form of sensory perception that we didn't understand. But it does look psychic. The dog won't let him get on the boat. Seconds later, a huge, great steamship or some very big craft plows down the little boat and smashes it to pieces.
Oh, wow.
So I suspect, rummaging about, there's probably other cases like that where
Mm-hmm.
the dog is looking out for the owner in a way that the owner couldn't do.
Yeah, I absolutely believe stuff like that. I think our animals are way more perceptive, or are able to perceive things that we're just not able to do it. And I think, excuse me, in a lot of cases, our dogs are looking out for us, and have that ability to see psychically into the future, or just get like a weird sort of spidey sense that danger is coming, and to protect their owners.
Yeah, I was talking to a dog walker today, and he was trying to get his dog out of the water because it was chasing ducks happily. It was a retriever. It was a Labrador, so it was happy to be in the water with ducks. It was perfect. And I said to him, would she get home on her own if she had to? He said, yeah, probably would, but it's the traffic. I'm bothered about the traffic. And yeah, he I think agreed. The crazy things they can do. They can smell different types of cancer. They can detect an epileptic fit several hours before it happens, which is fascinating, I suppose, because you get these dogs that know there's a storm coming several hours, and the electrical factor in both cases might be a common kind of trigger there. And of course, what I've found, and I guess you've seen it, is that in quite a lot of poltergeist cases or ghost cases, fearless dogs, absolutely ferocious fearless dogs, go crazy scared about something that nobody else can see or hear, and they whimper and fly off. They won't go in a certain room. And I've come across a few cases where poltergeist stuff is flying off all the time and things are shooting around the house, but the dog will act up kind of 5 seconds before the vase shoots across the room, and that is fascinating because people who've observed this very carefully say that the object, the ornament, the lump of coal, whatever it is, before it shoots across the room, if you're lucky, you can see it vibrating in a kind of build-up before it actually takes off. So it's as though there's something happening that we're not sensitive to, but the dog is clocking. There is a force here. There is something wrong in the air, and it's about to kick off. And sure enough, bang, whoosh, it all, goes haywire seconds later.
Yeah, I've kind of witnessed that firsthand with several of my dogs, that they'll stand kind of facing the wall and there'll be nothing there, and they'll be barking at seemingly nothing, and then something will happen in the room. A book will fall, or something will move slightly, but they're barking and letting me know that something's there, but I can't see anything.
So it is poltergeist activity, probably. But
yeah, there's something. And I've had when we were talking about poltergeist, kind of slightly off topic with the animals and everything, but I've witnessed shadow creatures and strange sort of poltergeist activity in it all kind of originated in this one apartment that I was living in for a couple of years, and just the weirdest things happened in that apartment. I saw spirits, I saw balls of energy, I've had things move, shadow creatures, everything. It was pretty incredible.
Well, yeah. And you wonder with the dogs, and I think cats do sometimes act up with it. Is there a link to the fact that, time and again, children can see ghosts, and it checks out later what they say. What did it look like? It looked like this. Oh, right, that is X, Y, Z, who fits the description, who died at such a time, who you wouldn't have known the picture of, you wouldn't have seen. You were too young. And I've got so many stories like that, kind of old historic ones, but ones people just told me, looked me in the eye, and they're pretty mind-blowing. And you think, why is it, that kids can see ghosts up to a certain age and then they just lose that? And
yeah, what is that ability?
Yeah, there's a link with the animal kind of brain, the animal consciousness.
And then we have that dog from Japan that waited for his owner that passed away, and this dog waited at the train station for 9 years waiting for their owner to return. So there's that connection, doesn't just not necessarily having to travel long distances, but just that devotion, that connection that they have with their owners.
Yeah,
is there.
That's amazing, isn't it? 9 years. I remember that story. I can't remember the details very well, but yeah, there's similar stories like that. You reminded me of one actually, which is perhaps worth bringing up in this context. I just found it recently, and it's pretty staggering. And it comes just about from this century, January 2000. It might be reporting on something I think that happened a bit earlier, but it's reported in 2000, and it's pretty mind-blowing and paranormal in its own way, because it is this, that a chap called Goodyear, Mr. Goodyear, dies in his 70s or 80s, I'm not sure, but he's got a collie dog, a border collie, classically very, very intelligent, and these are the ones that make a lot of these journeys, and it's devoted to him, adores him. He's known it since a puppy, and this dog called Spot reacts in a very peculiar way when Goodyear dies. And what happens is this. The dog is not taken to the funeral. He's not taken to the grave, as far as anyone knows. And Goodyear has been dead 5 months, I think, at least. And the collie disappears. People are trying to find out, where is it? And the collie is found lying over this man's grave.
Oh, wow.
In quite a state. Now, if anyone's going to pull the dog smelled something, well, the guy's been dead 5 months. He's 6 feet under. He's in a coffin. So I guess we could run the science on that, but I think it's fairly sensible to say that he could not smell the guy. I mean, my question there is, is he homing in on his owner's soul? So to wrench that sort of screw of the psychic imprint of the living, is he able to do that on the guy's soul if that is still hovering around the grave?
Yeah, it opens up a whole can of worms of death and life, and what does it mean to be alive, and do we have a soul, and if so, then are these animals psychically attached to it in a lot of these cases?
Yeah, I mean, I've never seen one like that before, but I suspect there are others hiding away, waiting to be found. And yeah, I mean, one other that you remind me of actually is that Robert Charman makes a very clever case in these article on animal homing, where he's got a cow doing it, he's got various birds doing it, he's got cats. And a big American cat story you can perhaps come to. But he's also got an essay in the same collection on a character you probably know. She's quite famous I think she's dead now, but Dr. Elizabeth Mayer, who was a psychologist, a sort of straight, academic psychologist for a long time. And she had a harp stolen. It belonged to her daughter, and it was a very special instrument. The daughter wouldn't play anything else after it was stolen at a concert. She was absolutely distraught. And Mayer was at the end of her wits. The police said, look, you'll never get it back. So Mayer, against her own kind of instinct or judgment, went to a psychic, a dowser, as they're sometimes called, who could remote view objects. And he got a map, and he told her in a matter of seconds virtually, yeah, it's still in Oakland in California. And she ended up putting a note out to people saying, look, deliver it back, there'll be a reward, there'll be no questions asked. And she gets the harp back. Now, this changes her life, this incident. It changes her view of science, of the paranormal. And she ends up in an odd situation where she loses a watch, which is quite important to find. And it's a long story, but the point is that the watch is in a completely unlikely place, in a cupboard in the house. And she suddenly finds herself in a kind of zombie trance-like state. She feels like she's being walked through the whole experience. She's not really in control. It's definitely not a normal mindset. It's not a mindset of, have I looked here already, whatever. She's like an automaton, and she goes to the back of this cupboard where the watch simply shouldn't be, and she finds it.
Wow.
And the point that Charman makes brilliantly, I think, is that the case is weirdly like the dogs, because they're described explicitly as if they're being ridden by an alien force. You know, there's something takes them over. They get into a completely different mindset, a completely different zone. So there do seem to be possibilities for humans to behave like this as well. I guess maybe traditional peoples, you know, Aboriginals and so on, have done it and still do it more easily.
Yeah, and that brings up the question too about UFO abductees. I was talking to someone earlier in the week, and they were talking about a story where this gentleman kind of just woke up out of the blue, wrote a note, and then left a note for his wife saying that he'd be gone for 10 days. Totally uncharacteristic of him, and walked outside, and then he encountered an ET, and which took him up in their spaceship, and the whole story happened. But just those more and more you hear about with abduction stories that they go into these trance states, and they don't remember there's missing time and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's a new one to me. I've read some crazy things and heard some crazy stories, and I believe something's going on. But the idea that he's got a sort of forewarning somehow that he's been prepared, you know, to give notice to his wife, it's quite considerate in a way, isn't it? That like, look, don't be alarmed. But I'll never be surprised really at anything in that field. And some of the odd kind of sleep paralysis abductions, you know, peculiarly strange. And also the occasional overlap between UFO cases, abductions, and poltergeist activity. You know, you get suddenly poltergeist activity kicking off after an encounter where it's never happened in the house before. So that also makes you wonder.
Yeah, and when the animals who disappear and appear hundreds, if not thousands of miles away in the blink of an eye, they're there 1 minute with their family, and then they disappear completely, and they show up in different states, different countries, days or months later. How does that happen? So there's, I think there all these stories and all this whole phenomenon is they're related somehow.
That's interesting. So they're not harmed.
They're not harmed.
Most of these.
No, I've read a number of cases where I can't think of. I don't have them written down here, but just animals have disappeared and then they've shown up in a different state. A few months later, the family's kind of given up on finding the dog. They just figure it ran away, and then all of a sudden, because of they were tagged or something like that, they were able to locate the dog, or someone had located the dog in a completely different area, and with no explanation of how the dog got there.
Well, that reminds me of a couple of cases. I think, you know, you just don't know with this one in 1949, but in America, there was a guy called Bill Nichols, and he let his dog Tinker out for a walk in New Jersey in, I think, 1943 by the look of it, and it didn't come back. And, you know, time goes by and he thinks, well, look, I guess the dog's not come back. It's been stolen. It's been killed somehow, who knows. And then 6 years later, the dog calmly comes in, gets into his favorite chair and curls up to go to sleep. So nothing's happened. Now, I mean, we just don't know. You know, there's not much detail. All sorts of things could have happened. It could have been stolen. It could have, you know, been taken off on a car a long way. I don't know. But there was one that I was kind of thinking, I'd like to know what this dog was up to for 6 years.
Yeah.
And didn't seem too fussed when it came back. There was another one, if I can find it, which is recent, and it's the microchip thing you say, you know, where in 2020, a family missed their Labrador. It was a cross between a retriever and a border collie, so kind of sharp sort of dog. And they had moved from Kansas and they've moved from Missouri to Kansas, a distance of about 60 miles, a bit less than that. And this family in Kansas one day finds a strange dog on the doorstep. What's this dog doing here? It looks kind of like it wants to be here. And they check, find the microchip, notice that the name rings a bell, and they think, this was the family that lived in this house before. So I think this is just one of a dog going home because it preferred the house. But it's interesting that, it preferred the house to the people. It's more of a cat kind of behavior, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
It's a bit hurtful to the poor owners. But also, it's interesting, it struck me that if you think about the sort of sociology of this, there must have been cases like that where the dog just likes its old home. It gets on the trail. It can do this somehow. It gets back to the old house. In the pre-microchip days, people just think, it's a nice doggy, we'll take it in. But they never find out where it came from. So the story kind of dies, the details of the homing. They just think it's a random stray dog. But with the microchips, of course, you've got so much more evidence and traceability now.
Yeah, exactly. There's probably, like you said, a lot of these stories that they find a stray dog, stray cat, and they take it in, but there's a bigger story behind it where it actually came from. And it makes sense. Some people prefer a house and don't want to move, and why not the animals too? They can come back, and they didn't have the choice to move.
Yeah, well, a woman I was talking to yesterday in Seattle, when we were talking about the blind dog, she had a blind cat at the sort of latter stages of its life, completely blind. But you could not stop this cat constantly going back to the old house. I have to check how far away it was, but it got there completely blind. All the time. You took it back Wednesday to your actual house, and it was back at the old one on Thursday. And she got to the station, just sort of was taking food over to feed the cat because it was too much trouble constantly bothering to bring it home, and it didn't want to stay. It was deeply attached to this house. There, must have been some kind of weird signal to get it over there.
Because it can't be memory. It can't be a memory, like a muscle memory or guiding it. Like you said, there's got to be something else at play.
I'll have to check the distance because that's an interesting factor. But I've got a good long one here actually with the Pomeranian. If we've got a moment for this, because it's pretty epic. It's the one that I think. In America, as far as I know, we're always getting new ones, but this one is the closest rival to Bobbie because it's a Pomeranian, 4 years old, called Jeep, and the family is on what's probably a holiday or a trip in the Blue Ridge Mountains in Kentucky in 1940. I'm kind of counting backwards here, 1947 probably, and the dog gets frightened by something, or it sees a rabbit, or I don't know, and it just jumps out of the car. They can't find it, they can't get it back. So poor family goes off with the young daughter, who's about 12, and they go back to New York. And 16 months later, the Pomeranian trots back into the house in New York, spotted by the 14-year-old girl, and it sees its old basket. It's particularly when it sees its old basket, it's convinced that it's home, and then it'll eat and drink. Quite a state,
Yeah.
But, that was apparently 1,000 miles, so that wasn't bad going for a pretty small, compact little dog.
Yeah, my Pomeranian, he's an interesting character, but I don't think he would survive a trip like that.
Well, my only hunch was, in the sort of knack of, it's a bit like a panda. It's an animal that simply shouldn't survive according to all the laws of evolution, but it's so cute that it has to be protected. You think maybe the Pomeranian warmed the hearts of various ladies at the back door and got pampered and fed on its way. 16 months is a long time, so it didn't rush, certainly. Perhaps it was having a nice rest.
Yeah, well, that's a nice thought. And then being taken care of. and pampered, because they definitely need their pampering, the Pomeranians.
Yeah. I think Queen Victoria was fond of them. They were her dogs among many. Yeah. But one I remember, if we've got a moment for it, which gives another twist on this, takes us over to Italy. There were, through the 19th century, and there was a great American one, a lot of railway dogs that just loved riding on trains in the days when it was quite easy to jump on and off a train. And they became mascots. They became beloved kind of national animals. One in America was called Oni, that died at the end of the 19th century. An earlier one in Britain was called Railway Jack, and it was presented to royalty 3 times. It had its obituary in about 25 papers when it died. But the latest one that I know of was a dog called Lampo in Italy. It turned up out of nowhere in a station near Rome in the late 1950s. And there's a whole book, is a beautiful, beautiful book that the train employee Barlatani wrote about Lampo and his family. And it's a long story, but the bits that are interesting to us is that one day they took Lampo, who Barlatani basically adopted, to the seaside. He got lost. He couldn't be found. They drove home quite a way to Barlatani's house, and Lampo simply came back home under his own steam. The other point was that he was finally exiled by the station master, who was over Barlatani and couldn't argue about it, because he was considered a bit dangerous. I mean, this was into the early 60s, and the automatic train doors would get him stuck in the sort of pneumatic mechanism. So he was exiled all the way to Naples, and everyone's heartbroken. Barlatani's little daughter's estate. Barlatani gives up on him, and several weeks or months later, the dog just comes back. I mean, it tends to get on a train to come back. It loves trains. But how does it know which trains to get onto? The whole of Italy, how does it find the right place? The station master says, I'm sorry, it's too much. The dog is going right to the foot of Italy now. So he sends it even further down past Naples, to the sort of toe of Italy. And they really give up on the dog. And then months later, it's getting on for a year or something, the dog turns up again. It's quite a state. But it's fortified against all exile. And the other kind of fascinating thing, because there's a character involved in this story who I think is still alive today, probably in her 70s. Barlatani, he sort of adopted it at his house, but the dog actually liked to sleep at the station, a little station called Campiglia Marittima. So because it got fond of his family, every single weekday, the dog would catch a train in the morning from Campiglia to Piombino. It would get off at that station. It would walk to Barlatani's house around breakfast time. It would pick up his 4-year-old daughter, Mirna. It would walk her to kindergarten. It would come back to the house. I don't know if it went straight to the house or it went straight to the station, but it would catch another train from Piombino to Marittima, where it liked to be. I know this is quite complicated, but, it's the complications that are fascinating.
Yeah.
Then in the afternoon, it had to get the train back from Campiglia to Piombino again, walk to the kindergarten this time, meet the girl at the gate, walk her home. And I hope the photo is still kicking around, but you can see a lovely photo of this dog jauntily trotting along, guarding this 4-year-old girl, Mirna, who I think is around and is still on Facebook nowadays.
That is unbelievable.
So, Lampo was a heck of a thing. He was a celebrity in his late days, and a lot of dogs could do this on trains, get where they wanted to go.
Most people can't get to where they want to go on trains. They can't figure it out.
Modern British trains, even if you are quite sharp, you're just at the mercy of utter chaos and gangsters, basically.
Yeah, and this dog is able to navigate the system, and
it almost never go wrong.
Yeah, wow. And that kind of reminds me of this show that it's not on anymore. It was, I think, late 70s, early 80s over here, called The Littlest Hobo. And it was about this dog that, when you mentioned about dogs on trains and train cars and that sort of thing, it was this dog that would, every episode, he was with, like, in a different situation. He would get on a train and he would just go walking from town to town and getting into trouble and saving people's lives and that sort of thing. So it's just a funny story that I guess there's some truth to where like the origins of where that show came from, I guess.
Yeah, I think I remember it. I must ask my brother because I think I can't really remember any details now. But
Yeah.
I know the name very strongly, and I think we probably watched it because that would have been our sort of childhood TV generation.
Yeah, because it was a German Shepherd, I think. And
was it? Okay, it rings a very strong bell. Yeah. No, that was nice. Yeah, I'll ask my brother Chris about what he remembers. Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of off topic, but we'll wrap up in a few minutes here. But just yeah, on our show we drink a lot of coffee and try lots of different flavors and brews of coffee.
Great.
If you could have a coffee with someone from the past, who would it be? And why?
Wow. I'll probably answer you differently on different days, but I'll give you an answer which has been on my mind for a while, and I'll try and make this short because I'm conscious of the time, but it is a long, long story, which I actually tell this story at length in a new book coming out soon called The History of Disgust, which has been an epic project. And it is a woman called Christina Skarbek in her Polish Jewish name originally, or Christine Granville in her anglicized form because she became a British citizen. And she was a spy in the Second World War. She was an extraordinary character. I love coffee as well, by the way, so it's
perfect.
A good match. She was an extraordinary character. She's known as Churchill's favorite spy. And she was absolutely fearless, but it was her bond with animals, among other things, that suddenly came back to me when you said this. She was at one point in occupied France, out at night, when a German patrol came by with an attack dog, an Alsatian, off the leash, and the dog leapt on her as she was hiding under a bush. Now, this rings true because I trust the author of the biography, and actually I know personally quite a bit about her time in France, as I'll explain. But the fact is that she simply put her arm around the dog. She had just, a second or two to do this. The Germans are all marching by, fierce for any spies and collaborators. And she simply made the dog fall in love with her.
Oh, wow.
Under this bush with the Germans marching by. The fact is that they kept the dog for the rest of their time in occupied France, and it never wanted to leave them. So the dog gave a sort of little whimper, falls in love with this woman in a moment. Now, this is pretty plausible story, the way it rings true as it's told. But the other one is that at one point she and a fellow spy, a male spy, were going by car across the border from, I think, Bulgaria into Turkey. And there were a set of customs officials that were being a nightmare. There wasn't really anything suspect about them, but the officials were just a bunch of bastards and wouldn't let them through. They took everything out of the damn car. It was packed to the roof. They made them take the wheels off the car or the tires or something. It was the middle of the night. They're sick to death. They're freezing and they're tired in this little hut. Anyway, at the point when they're at their lowest ebb, this guy comes in with a ferocious dog, probably an Alsatian again, on a leash, and it leaps at the male spy, whose name is eluding me for a moment, but it leaps at him, and then Christina simply, the guy says, don't go near this dog. It's the fiercest thing I've ever had. Christina just falls on the floor and throws her arms around it, and the dog falls in love with her again.
Wow.
And they then finally get told, right, go, you can go across the border. So in amazing relief, they get the car together, they drive over the border, and there's a kind of no man's land of about 3 miles, and they're halfway across this. It's pouring with rain, so it's packing with rain. I think it's still dark. And suddenly, Christina says, stop. So he stops the car in the middle of this no man's land. She gets out of the car, she stands in the pouring rain, and she whistles, and the dog bolts out of the blue across no man's land, and again is in a rapture of delight to simply be with her. They say, shall we keep the dog? I think, it's a big dog, we've got to feed it all the time, we better send it back. They're reluctant, they send it back to the border. But I've never come across anything like that. I mean, I've got a passage which I'd like to read before we completely close up, which is very beautiful about animals. But But there's something about that woman. She was very glamorous and very beautiful, constantly having affairs, breaking people's hearts. But also, perhaps most importantly of all, I knew a remarkable woman when I was in my teens and 20s, and she died only in 2008, so not that long ago. And she was one of those quietly extraordinary characters that didn't become famous, but she changed a lot of people's lives. And she never really talked about her family, but in the war, she had a brother called Francis Camer that you could look up. His obituary and his kind of record is pretty well attested all over the place. He died not that long ago, and he should have died during the war. He was arrested, banged to rights by the Gestapo with a couple of others. He was thrown into a prison by a pretty nasty Gestapo head. And Christina, in a kind of epic feat of, again, absolutely nerveless courage and bravado, bullied, lied to, bribed the head of the Gestapo for 3 hours to get Francis out of prison. And he went on to die in his bed after a great career as a teacher and a headmaster. So my friend's brother owed his life almost certainly to Christina Skarbek or Granville.
Wow.
Who was just absolute force of nature, really, if you've got to sum her up,
Yeah, it sounds like an incredible story.
You probably didn't need the coffee, to drive her on, but but it would be great to sit with her, have a French coffee in some cafe in the back of Beyond.
Absolutely. So you want to read? You have a passage you want to read?
Yeah. I never come across anything like this. A friend lent me a book by a guy you might know called Michael Benteen, who was a British comedian, actor, a kind of man of many parts in his heyday, and he was psychic, and he had an awful lot of psychic experience. He courageously kind of advocated for psychic phenomena, paranormal phenomena, in all sorts of scenarios. But the thing that really stuck with me in his memoirs, called The Door-Marked Summer, was just before the Second World War. And this kind of chimes with me at the moment when Ukrainians are going through such an awful time. It was summer 1939, and the shadow of war was really on top of Britain by this point. It seemed inevitable. And he was very unnerved. He was a young teenager, I think, Michael. And he happened to know through his father a guy called Eddie, who was thoroughly psychic, but a very kind of modest, anonymous character. He simply ran a grocery shop, and he wasn't after any fame or money or anything like this. But when he realized what a state Michael was getting into, he said one evening to Michael's father, Adam, will you drive us out into the country? It's not far, and there's something I want to show Michael. So in Benteen's words here, we duly drove out a few miles into the Weald of Kent, those peaceful, sheltered valleys, one of the most attractive features of the Garden of England. Eddie asked Pop to draw into the side of a country road, and we got out and followed him down a short, narrow track that led to some woods at the foot of the valley. The night was calm and quite warm, with a few lazy clouds drifting across the moonlit sky. We walked silently in single file through the lush ferns that now rustled round us. The dense underbrush continued as we passed into the thick clumps of trees which made up the small wood. Here the light was considerably reduced, yet Eddie continued to lead the way effortlessly. Quite unexpectedly, we came out of the clusters of saplings and trees into a small clearing, which must have been centrally placed in the wood, and there Eddie stopped. The moon had come out from behind a large billowing cloud, and now lit the whole scene almost as brightly as daylight, but with a soft, silvery light. You could almost hear silence. Eddie turned to me as I stood a few feet behind him in front of my father. He smiled and gestured to me to listen. Then he turned and in a low voice, halfway between a whistle and a word, gave one strange, short, gentle call. Immediately, from every corner of the wood, the birds, the beasts, even the insects, and I felt every tree and plant answered him. It was a great, joyous chorus of greeting to a much-loved
friend. There was no alarm in that spontaneous answer, just a massive response of nature to nature, light attracts light. Tears streamed down my face, and I could see my father crying too. Marvellous natural tears of joy that seemed to wash away the fears and doubts that had assailed me, reaffirming that nature is far stronger than man alone. I shall never forget that moment.
Wow. Oops. Yeah. Man and nature. There's so many untapped things that we just don't understand.
No, I'd read a lot of strange things by the time I picked that book up, and I'd never read anything like that. I never have since.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose if you asked me tomorrow, I'd say I'd like to have a coffee with Eddie. Back in the 1930s would be another choice.
Well, let's wrap it up. But how can our listeners get a hold of you if they want to find out more information and get a copy of your books?
Yeah, thank you. The books are all on Amazon. Basically, Richard Sugg is a fairly unusual author name. So just about everything under Richard Sugg is by me. There's 14 out at the moment. The dog one is great fun if you want a fun, light read, but it's got some kind of important history buried in it as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that's Bobbie the Wonder Dog, which I wrote as a response to the kind of awful racism and xenophobia of Brexit, and I tried to do it joyfully. A Singing Mouse at Buckingham Palace is a nice collection of animal stories. I'm on Twitter at Dr. Sugg, so it's capital D, capital S, just a short DR Doctor. And I use that quite a lot. I do videos and try and publicize the books. The History of Disgust, different kind of book, and it's kind of crazy and startling, but not paranormal.
Mm-hmm.
That will be out, I hope, in a few days' time. I've got a bit of a nightmare with the footnotes, but that's coming. I do have a couple of collections already on ghosts. So there's A Century of Ghost Stories, which is really thoroughly paranormal. And then there's A Century of Supernatural Stories, which is partly folklore and things that people believed which were deeply untrue, like this person was a witch. But a lot of it is pretty startling, and it staggered me. Beliefs about witches, fairies, craziness that was going on in the 19th century. So these are apparently real stories, and you can trust most of them. And I'm working. If people do want to get in touch with animal stories, I'd love to hear them, and I'd love to hear ghost stories. Anything. The kind of things you were telling me, I'd like to follow up,
Mm-hmm.
Ghost stories, poltergeist stories, time slips, out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences. I'm researching all of this. And I as I said, I get these people talking to me, telling these stories all the time, constantly. And so I think, why aren't these people joined up into a critical mass? And the title of that book, which is coming, I hope, before too long, is We Need to Talk About Ghosts. If enough people just keep talking about it, with a bit of courage and without being afraid of embarrassment and mockery and so forth, I think there's a huge, amazing kind of wave of people waiting to make a great transformation here by showing, the paranormal is weirdly normal in that sense, at least. It's everywhere, around you. It's not wacky Hollywood Gothic castles. It's your next door neighbor.
Yeah. It's like that, the UFO UAP phenomenon, that it's becoming more acceptable to mainstream to be talking about those types of topics.
Yeah, I'm pleased to see that. I'm pleased to see you covering, because I was reading Leslie Kean about 2 or 3 years ago, and what she's saying has suddenly broken into the main media, in a really healthy way. But it took a long time.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much for being on the show, and we'd love to have you back, and we can to talk about the other paranormal books, about going in a little more detail about the real vampires and the paranormal.
I'd love to do that. Many thanks. It's been a really nice hour. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you. So what are your thoughts on this? Do you have this connection with your pets? Let us know in the comments. Before we close out for this week, don't forget to follow the show wherever you're listening. If you're watching on YouTube, click the subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow. If you like the show but want to listen without ads, head over to Apple Podcasts, where we have a premium membership. For $2 a month, you get ad-free episodes, early access to new episodes, and all kinds of bonus content. Well, that's it for this week. Remember, being paranoid is smart. We'll see you next time. This has been a Story Monkey production.